Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's virtual Think and Drink, a program made possible with support from Oregon Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Oregon Cultural Trust. We're welcoming back Walidah Imarisha, who was our first ever Think and Drink presenter back in 2017. Remember back then when we could actually meet together in public? And we were at McMiniman's for a great program about racial justice and prison reform. Before I introduce Walidah, just a few organizational details. Walidah will be doing a Q&A following her presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box. Also, there's a link to an online survey in the program description box at the bottom of your YouTube screen. It's also available on our web calendar event listing for tonight's program. So please take a minute to fill those surveys out. We really appreciate any feedback. I'd also like to introduce Erin. She is our interpreter for tonight. A historian at heart, a reporter by right, and rebel by reason, Walidah Imarisha is an educator, writer, public scholar, and spoken word artist. She edited 2 anthologies, Octavias Brood, science fiction stories from social justice movements, and Another World is Possible. Her nonfiction book, Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 Stories of Crime, Prison, and Redemption, won a 2017 Oregon Book Award. She is also the author of the poetry collection Scars, Stars, and in 2015 received a Tiptree Fellowship for her science fiction writing. She is taught in Stanford University's program of Writing and Rhetoric, Pacific Northwest College of the Arts Masters in Fine Arts and Creative Writing, and Master in Critical Studies program, Portland State University's Black Studies Department. Please welcome Walidah Imarisha.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm so excited to be back here at the Deschutes Library, virtually at least. And thank you so much to Erin for the ASL interpretation. And thank you to Donovan and Matt for the tech support, which has become so vitally important in these times. So I am so excited to talk about Octavia E. Butler with y'all and her work and the way that her work has influenced me. And so, Octavia has really changed my life and taught me so much. She was a foundational part of the creation of what I call visionary fiction, which I'll talk about more, but really is the intersection of fantastical art and social change. And so I'm going to be going through some of Octavia E. Butler's writing and work using the lens of visionary fiction and really talking about the ways that Octavia's work can help us build new just futures. And so just a little bit about Octavia. I hope if folks haven't read her yet, you go to the library and get copies of her books. She was a Black feminist science fiction writer and intellectual. She started writing in the 1970s and is very much sort of considered the one of the founders of the Black futurist movement, the Black science fiction movement that we are in now. She won the MacArthur Genius Grant. She was the first science fiction author to do so. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2006, but her work is still incredibly impactful to so much of what's happening now. And I think that folks are still coming to her work to help understand the world that we're in and help to envision a different future. And I think one of the things that is so unique about Octavia's work is that she looks at and offers us a different way of looking at both identity and power using science fiction and fantastical work. And so her work is very much about who is centered, but also what is the collective relationship to power? How do we reimagine that relationship to power? And those 2 pieces are fundamental to visionary fiction. So I actually wanted to start off by playing a video of Octavia speaking. And it is a video that I've brought together from 2 different interviews that she did, one on the Charlie Rose show and one for a documentary on Black sci-fi from BBC. And unfortunately, they are not captioned, but you can find both of them on YouTube. So if you just look up the headers that are on there, you can find them on YouTube. But I just want to bring her voice into this because these 2 clips together talk about those 2 pieces of identity and power. So I'm just going to play this now.
What then is central to what you want to say about race?
So aside from, hey, we're here.
Yeah, right, that's right. And we're going to be here.
Yeah.
We are here.
When I was just getting started, around 79, I guess it was, my books were just starting to do reasonably well. I was on a convention, right, a science fiction convention panel. The guy next to me was an editor, and he said he thought that it wasn't really necessary to have Black characters in science fiction, because you could always say make any racial statement you needed to make by way of extraterrestrials. And if he was trying to start trouble, he certainly succeeded. It's a wonderful way to think about possibilities. It's a wonderful way to explore exotic politics. It's a wonderful way, it's a freedom. It's a way of doing anything you want. There are all sorts of walls around other genres. Romances, mysteries, westerns. There are no real walls around science fiction. We can build them, but they're not there naturally. My Patternists are people, a gathering of mutants, really. They're not extraterrestrial or anything, and they're not gathered for any particularly good purpose. They're gathered because a rather odious character is lonely and very long-lived, so he breeds them. He also eats them, in a sense. I think, really, a lot of my early writing had to do with my own feelings of powerlessness. So I dealt often with power, with what it did to people, what they did with it when they got it. And what I do in the Xenogenesis books is explain what that is. I have aliens who arrive and who are interested in us because they are natural genetic engineers. They are gene traders, as a matter of fact, but who tell us that we have this conflict within ourselves. All too often, our intelligence serves our hierarchical tendencies, so that we tend to one-up ourselves to death.
So again, that's just a short clip of 2 short clips of Octavia talking about her work. But that framing that she provides is part of what inspired me to co-edit.
What then is central to what you want
to co-edit with my friend, Adrienne Marie Brown, our collection, Octavias Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. And this was really the foundation of visionary fiction, sort of a culmination for me. So I had been working on visionary fiction separately. Adrienne had been working around Octavia Butler emergent strategy work. And then we came together like Voltron to come up with the idea of putting together an anthology of fantastical writings by organizers, activists, and change makers. So it's Octavias Brood comprises of 20 short stories and 2 essays. And again, it's science fiction, speculative fiction, written by organizers, activists, and change makers. And many of the folks in the collection had never written fiction, let alone science fiction. Some of the folks are very well known in the science fiction scene. We were lucky enough to get Tanana Reeve-Dew, Terry Bisson, LeVar Burton from Star Trek Next Generation, who's also a writer. But the majority of folks were people Adrienne and I knew for their work organizing, imagining different futures, and building them into existence. but we knew that they would be incredible at writing visionary fiction, fantastical work, because the premise of Octavias Brood is all organizing is science fiction. So every time we imagine a world without poverty, without prisons, without borders, that is science fiction. But we can't build what we can't imagine. So we absolutely need imaginative spaces like science fiction that allow us to throw out everything we've been told is possible and to start with the question, what is the world that we want, rather than what is a realistic win? Unfortunately, I think a lot of our movements get trapped by this ideal of realism in our organizing. And really, that's a method of social control, because all real substantive social change was considered to be utterly unrealistic at the time that people were trying to make it, because it fundamentally challenged the power structure. And so it's vitally important to have spaces where we can transcend everything we're told is realistic or possible, so that we can imagine the impossible and then make it our lived reality. And so, you know, for us, it's very much the framing is, once our imaginations are unshackled, liberation is limitless. So we need creative, imaginative spaces that help us to practice imagining what we're told is impossible. And that is really the foundation of Octavias Brood, which of course is named in honor of Octavia E. Butler. And so much of our understanding of the possibilities, the radical possibilities of science fiction came from Octavia's work. Through, you know, my own reading and developing a visionary fiction, through Adrian's work doing Octavia Butler strategy sessions where folks would come together, read Octavia Butler, and say, what lessons can we learn from this for our organizing and our movement? And so, you know, this intersection of science fiction and social change is what I call visionary fiction. And, you know, once I was sort of kind of going more deeply into visionary fiction, coming up with the principles of it, I realized the place that I saw this in practice first was the work of Octavia E. Butler, and it had an immense impact on me. I think all of Octavia's work speaks to, you know, every moment. Her work is really timeless, but perhaps the book that very clearly speaks to this moment is her series, the Parable series, which includes Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. And, you know, first, there were two published books, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, but there were actually supposed to be many more in the collection. So Octavia envisioned Parable of the Trickster, Parable of the Teacher, Parable of Chaos, Parable of Clay, and possibly more as well. She actually wrote about 500 pages of Parable of the Trickster, but she never finished it. It's just kind of the beginning over and over again. And there have been scholars who are going through her papers, which are housed at the Huntington Library, who have written pieces kind of exploring Parable of the Trickster and the ideas behind that. But, you know, one of the foundations of this story, Parable of the Sower, is set in the 2020s. It was written in the early 1990s. It was published in the early 1990s, and it is, you know, slightly dystopian future to ours at this point, where there's massive climate catastrophe that's happened. The wealth gap has grown immensely. You know, there is, you know, a regression in democracy, racial tensions are incredibly exacerbated as part of that. There's a huge anti-immigration movement. It's just basically, you know, for many people, it felt very predictive and even prophetic. And in fact, folks have been reading Parable and turning to it so much that it became a bestseller 14 years after Octavia E. Butler's death. So just, I think, last month, Octavia finally reached the New York Times bestseller list 14 years after her death for Parable of the Sower, because it is so prophetic and because it centers not just around the, you know, immense violence and catastrophes of that world, but because it centers in the possibility of change. And so in Parable of the Sower, the main character, Lauren Olamina, is a young teenage Black girl who creates another way of living. Some call it a philosophy, some call it a religion, but it is a radical re-envisioning of how to be with one another that focuses on collectivism, on communal change, on a coming together, and a healing and a reimagining. And I think many people, including me, have definitely been turning towards that vision for now. You know, and Octavia had this vision, right? She was what I consider to be a visionary fiction writer, and she also used that in her own life. So in the Huntington Library archives, she wrote a lot of notes to herself that were really about imagining the kind of future she wants, the kind of writer she wants to be, and putting that out into the world. And I love this one that says, word weaver, world maker, storyteller, bestseller, yes. World weaver, world maker, storyteller, bestseller, now. And, you know, she dreamed that for herself and then, you know, made it a reality, even though it did take 14 years later for her to reach the bestseller list, but she did that. So just sharing a few other pieces from her archive, her journal writing, so you can kind of see the ways that she conceptualized, she, you know, dreamed this up and then built it into reality. And that is a fundamental part of visionary fiction. So just wanting to go through a few of the principles of visionary fiction that I've come up with over the years. And I will kind of look at them through the lens of Octavia's work, so we can explore that a little bit more. But sort of the overall definition of visionary fiction that I've created is that it is fantastical art that helps us understand and challenge existing power structures and supports us in imagining paths to dreaming and creating more just worlds. And so I've, you know, created some principles of visionary fiction that kind of help to see what that is. And as I said, they center around the two main areas of identity and power. And so identity is about who is, you know, centered in these stories, whose story is being told, also who has agency in that story, whose leadership is centered. So visionary fiction centers the leadership of the marginalized and most affected. And absolutely, Octavia's work did that and does that continually. I think every one of her stories was centered around Black women and young Black women with disabilities, excuse me, queer Black women who were at the intersections of identity and oppression. And so it's looking through their eyes as well as recognizing that when we center folks who are sitting at the intersections of identity, that's what we see what true liberation looks like for the entire community. And so it's incredibly important to recognize that when we talk about identity, it's not just putting forward cardboard cutouts of identity and saying, oh, this is our Black character, this is our queer character, this is our disabled character. It's about realizing the intersections of identity that we all have, and that when we center folks who sit at those intersections of identity, that is when we see what true liberation looks like. And so, you know, again, Octavia was very much rooted in that throughout her life and her writing. And so, you know, these are just some of the images that are the main characters of her stories. So you can see a sense of that from her books. Wild Seed, Mind of My Mind, her Patternists series, Fledgling, Kindred, all of these stories centering, you know, Black women and Black trans folks or non-binary folks, and rooting in putting those images forward. And for me, Octavia's books were the first time I saw a Black woman on the cover of a science fiction book. And I found it when I was in high school. And I had no idea who Octavia Butler was, but I knew that I was going to buy this book and buy everything else she had ever written because of how important that representation of people who look like me was and is for me as a young person. So the last piece of identity is around decolonized nonlinear dreaming. And we can talk more about this if folks are interested. But for me, this is very much challenging the notion of change as a linear progression towards greatness, which is a colonial idea. And it instead recognizes that communities of color have always had a vast amount of knowledge, that those dreams of our ancestors are part of what we are living out today. And so we don't just want to go forward into some, you know, space future where we're living in spaceships that are just all chrome and white. We want to recognize that what has come is part of what we need to build the future. And visionary fiction is strongly rooted in an understanding of communities of colors visions as central to the creation of change and new futures. And so for me, this piece, this non-linear piece, this time traveling Blackness, very much is rooted in Octavia's book Kindred, which focuses on a Black woman who is actually pulled back in time from 1976 to the antebellum period, to the slave period. And she's pulled back and forth through time actually by her ancestor, who is a white slave owner. And she is having to contend with and grapple with what does it mean to be a Black woman, and how different and how not different that experience is throughout that period of time. And so again, you know, Octavia's work covers so much of this. The second piece, so again, the first piece was identity. The second piece is power. So engaging with power, as Octavia talked about in that clip that we saw, making visible systems of power and imagining different relationships to power. And I think that's one of the most challenging and difficult parts of this visionary fiction work is how do we imagine different relationships to power so that we can build a different future. And it's hard because we've all been raised in this society and we've been told, you know, this is how power functions in stories and in real life. And so it's really important to create space where we can imagine beyond what we've been told is how this works, and say, if if we want to start with what is an ideal world, what would that look like? And again, learning from so many of Octavia's books, we see that when we root in a different relationship to power, change in visionary fiction happens from the bottom up, not the top down. It is collective and decentralized. It is non-transactional and anti-capitalist. It is about valuing relationships rather than commodities. It's generative, it creates options, and it's real and to the bone. It's not surface reform. It is radical reimagining and transformation, which often means dismantling and replacing systems. And the last piece for visionary fiction that I think is just fundamental is that visionary fiction is not neutral and doesn't purport to be neutral. My co-editor, Adrienne Marie Brown, says, all art either advances or regresses justice. And we are very much clear that we are on the side of advancing justice and are proud of that, as was Octavia E. Butler and her work. So those are just some of the principles of visionary fiction. And, you know, again, I think it is so clear that Octavia rooted us and provided the sort of blueprint and guidance for so much of this framing. And I think, you know, there's so many incredible things about Octavia's work, but one of them is that, you know, folks talk about it, and often, especially for Parable of the Sower, talk about it as a dystopia. And while there are horrific things that are happening in that book that are institutionalized, I wouldn't necessarily call it a true dystopia, because the reality is while dystopia and utopia are interesting as genres in literature, they don't really exist in the real world, because there is no true dystopia as long as there is one person who can imagine something different and can work to build it into existence. And conversely, you know, Octavia herself said that she didn't have much use for utopia because it would require perfect people, and we're not likely to get those anytime soon. You know, humans are messy and beautiful and flawed, and so everything we create will have the same complexities in it. So there's always the opportunity to grow and to imagine more and to be better. And so, you know, I think part of why Octavia's work is neither dystopian or utopian at its core, but instead is realistic and hard but hopeful, is because her work is deeply rooted in her study of the now. Octavia was very clear that all of her work is built out of this place we are now, and the immense study that she gave to everything, to politics, to science, to space travel. She really studied and engaged deeply, but she really rooted in the present. And so I wanted to share this quote from her where she's talking about her parables series as a cautionary tale about the future, to show that she was very clear that this is not something to be read as escapist fantasy, but is a commentary on the now. It is to look at where we are now, what we are doing now, and to consider where some of our current behaviors and unattended problems might take us. I considered drugs and the effects of drugs on the children of drug addicts. I looked at the growing rich-poor gap, at throwaway labor, at our willingness to build and fill prisons, our reluctance to build and repair schools and libraries, and at our assault on the environment. In particular, I looked at global warming and ways in which it's likely to change things for us. I considered spreading hunger as a reason for increased vulnerability to disease. I imagined the United States becoming, slowly, through the combined efforts of lack of foresight and short-term, unenlightened self-interest, a third world country. And, you know, I think that this is really a cautionary, again, a cautionary tale that Octavia left for us. And many folks have considered her two books, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, to be very prophetic. And they're like, how did Octavia know? Octavia told us clearly from this, she studied where we were and extrapolated out, if we don't do things differently, this is where we will be. And unfortunately, we have not done things differently, and we are where pretty much she said we would be, even to the point of literally her telling us that a candidate like Trump was coming. So in Parable of the Talents, Octavia wrote a presidential candidate who was elected, who on a nationalist platform, very xenophobic, who wanted to build a wall between Mexico and America. She said it in 2032. And his slogan was, help us to make America great again. So again, Octavia warned us literally about what was coming. And again, it was by studying what is that she could extrapolate out. But I think the other piece that's really important to recognize is that she extrapolated out the ways that institutional oppression would intensify, but she also extrapolated out the ways that resistance would intensify and the ways that folks would continue to come together to build alternatives and different options and different futures, and to imagine and to create something different. And that's exactly what happens in the Parable collection. You know, I don't want to do any spoilers for folks, but you know, Lauren Olamina, the main character, again, who is a teenage black woman in the beginning of the Parable series, really looks around and says, we have to be different with each other. We have to be in this together. We have to be collective. We have to be communal. We have to make decisions as one. We have to think about everyone present. We have to make space for what everyone brings, because it makes us stronger when we all bring what we have. And her vision was to build a community called Acorn, and by and the larger vision of what she saw was called Earthseed. And so, you know, I think the fact that Octavia offered us a future that is very hard, you know, to read sometimes. I know when I was first reading Parable of the Sower, I had to stop and take breaks because it hit too close to home. And that was in the late 90s when I read it. So it's really close to home. But she didn't just leave us there with that dystopia. She gave us, you know, not a blueprint, but a North Star, a guiding light to say things can be different if we are different with each other. And it is up to us to decide if that's who and how we want to be. And you know, I've been lucky enough that I have been seeing folks engaging with Parable of the Sower so much this year. And I actually got to speak to middle school classes and high school classes that were reading Parable of the Sower. And they came out with just some of the most powerful, you know, incredible imaginings. One seventh grader actually said that every politician should be required to read Parable of the Sower before they get elected, which I was like, that sounds amazing to me. Give them homework. I was also lucky enough to connect with Pomona College, which had Parable of the Sower as their campus reads book for incoming freshmen and transfer students. And we actually ended up having folks write their own kind of earthseed verses, their own imaginings and lessons for the future. So being able to engage with Octavia's important words on many different levels, both intellectually and creatively, has been incredible. And, you know, it really leaves me rooted in this final quote from Parable of the Talents, which is the sequel to Parable of the Sower, that, you know, Octavia really, she claimed the right for us to dream, but also left us the responsibility to both dream different futures and then to build them into existence. So the quote is, "There seems to be solid biological reasons why we are the way we are. If there weren't, the cycles wouldn't keep replaying. The human species is a kind of animal, of course, but we can do something no other animal species has ever had the option to do. We can choose. We can go on building and destroying until we either destroy ourselves or destroy the ability of our world to sustain us, or we can make something more of ourselves." And I feel, again, like that is the right and the gift that Octavia has left us, and the responsibility that she has charged us with. And to me, this quote is really the heart of visionary fiction, that we all have the right to claim the future, that we have to create spaces that allow us to envision beyond what we've been told is possible, to truly imagine justice. And we have to go to fantastical places to do that, because we haven't seen that happen on a structural, institutional level. And yet, we know that this is possible because we can look to history, and we have seen again and again the fact that folks have dreamed what they have been told are impossible dreams of justice, and then they have changed the entire world to make those dreams reality. And that's the right that Octavia claimed for us. We have the right to dream, and we have the responsibility to build those dreams into better futures and better presents. So thank you all so much. I'm going to stop there and create space to open it up for any questions or comments or thoughts folks have from that.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Walidah?
Yes.
So awesome. And like I told you before we started today's presentation, I am in almost about halfway through Parables of the Talents. Really an amazing read. And so can we just talk a little bit about Lauren and her character? Just, I'm interested. The fact, or why do you think it was important for Octavia Butler to make Lauren a sharer? What is that she is able to feel people's emotions and physical pain? And there are quite a few characters in that book that are sharers, and I'm just wondering about that, and what do you think that brought to the story? Why was Octavia Butler, why did she include that element of those characters?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many things to talk about with Octavia that, there are like countless themes and ideas. She gives us so much to sit with and to contemplate. This idea of hyper empathy, which is the syndrome that Lauren Olamina has, the main character, where she perceives other people's physical pain and then feels it in her body. That is a consistent theme through Octavia's work, is this idea of forced empathy amongst humans as well as other sentient creatures. And I think that Octavia again and again included this in her work in different ways, because she felt like it was the way to be able to challenge what she said in that quote, that idea of our hierarchical natures as humans. which, you know, I might be a little more Pollyanna than Octavia. So I actually don't think that's fundamental to human nature. But Octavia very much believed that fundamental to human nature is the need to create hierarchy. And the only way to have the chance of challenging that is us feeling the impact of what we do to other people. But Octavia, you know, sort of being, you know, she talked about her own, you know, kind of contradictions of being a pessimist and like optimist. Was like, humans are not going to choose to do this, so it will have to be something that is forced upon them. And you see that theme again and again. So in the parables, it is this hyper empathy syndrome, but Lilith's brood has that, where humans are basically being assimilated into, you know, with an alien species. She talked about it a little. It's also called the Xenogenesis series, or Lilith's brood series. Uh, in the video, she talked about that these aliens come and basically are like, you cannot be allowed to destroy yourselves, so you have to connect with us. And in that process are sort of forced to emotionally connect with other people. It's true. It's a part of her book Fledgling, which is about vampires. It's part of her book, you know, her Patternists series, which, you know, is kind of, it's about telepaths and shapeshifters. So whatever genre Octavia is writing in, whether it's mutants, vampires, aliens, time travel, it's part of Kindred. She imagines humans having to feel the harm that they do to one another as a prerequisite for us choosing to be different. It's not a given, right? Because people, it's not that people don't know they're doing pain to each other. And I think Parable of the Sower is a great example of that, where you see folks who have hyper empathy, but still will harm someone else. So it's not a given that this forced empathy will make us better, but it's according to Octavia, it's sort of the only thing that will give us a chance to choose to be better. And I think that is very much a part of, of organizing and of imagining different futures, is to say, it's a fundamental piece of restorative justice or transformative justice, is to say, you have to empathize with the other person. If you've done harm to someone, you have to feel that harm to want to be different. And so, it's beautiful to see the ways that Octavia deftly includes that in these fantastical settings, and how clear that lesson translates into real world building, in the same way that it exists in her fantastical world building.
Yeah, I think that is such a fascinating thing about the feeling, the empathy of pain that you cause or the harm that you do, to make better connection, to maybe do things differently. So I have a question that's come through on the YouTubes, and it's from Megan, and she wonders, since an important aspect of visionary fiction is centering BIPOC perspectives, leadership, how can white people participate in visioning activities while honoring this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I thank you, Megan, for the question. And, I think it's important that while the majority of folks who are in Octavia's brood are Black, Indigenous folks of color, there are also a few white authors as well. And so Terry Bisson's book, Fire on the Mountain, is an incredible example of that. Terry is a phenomenal science fiction writer, was also deeply involved in white anti-racist organizing work in the 80s. And his his book Fire on the Mountain, which is an alternative timeline genre, which imagines what if John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859 against slavery had been successful and a separate Black nation was set up in the United States. I think, we included examples like that to be clear that there is, absolutely space in visionary fiction for everyone, and that we have to be centering the experiences, the leadership, and the voice of folks of color. So I think that there are many different ways that, white folks can be connected to visionary fiction and participate in it, both in writing it, in supporting it. But I think it's also very important for white creators to also say, especially if you have a platform, how can I create space for other folks who are not getting access to the kind of platforms that I am because I am white, and to really be doing the work to make that space. But if the question also is, as a white creator, how do I do this in a way that is authentic? I would encourage you to. There's an amazing collection called Writing the Other that's edited by Nisi Shawl, and really goes into how do you honor and create characters that are not just cardboard cutouts, and that perpetuate stereotypes and the sort of violence that literature has done to communities of color over the centuries, but actively participates in imagining something different. So I would encourage everyone to, start there. It's called Writing the Other. But I think, again, making sure that that we are centering the voices and vision and work of folks of color, both in literature and in the ways that that leads into real world change.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have another question from Cloudbreak. And Cloudbreak asks or states, one of the most powerful parts of the parable text for me as a person of color and a child of immigrants is Earthseed, the intersection of spirit, community, and strength. How can we tap into that today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you for that question, Cloudbreak. And yes, I think Earthseed is a really powerful framing. I feel like, we could talk about just Earthseed for hours because, for those who haven't read it, it is sort of the framework that Lauren Olamina creates to build this new future. And many folks have called it a religion, and many folks have said it's part of Christianity because, one of the central texts of it, and she includes little parables, little poetic phrases and stories, is, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And so folks have really interpreted this as a religion, but it's interesting because Lauren is saying, the only higher power is change. And, many of the other verses go on to say, the way, if you want to pray to change to God, then you need to get ready for change and be ready to shape it as much as possible, because that's the only thing. You can't implore change not to change. You can't beg it to be kinder to you. All you can do is be as ready as you possibly can for change, to try and shape it, to try and shape yourself to be the person you need to be to create the change you want. And then to know that you ultimately can't control everything. And so you will have to adapt along the way. And my co-editor, Adrienne Marie Brown, has written an amazing book called Emergent Strategy that I'd encourage Cloudbreak, you and other folks to check out, because it kind of furthers that intersection of spirituality and organizing and vision but in this world. And so it really is looking at how do we learn lessons from nature? How do we engage differently? How do we become different so that we can shape change in the way that we dream and long for? And so I would really encourage folks to, you know, to read Emergent Strategy anytime, but again, especially these times.
Especially now. Okay, we have so Megan did say thank you for answering her question. And we've just got one more, and I had written this down as well, but Cassie B has a question for you. She says, thank you so much for all you have shared. Are there authors of visionary fiction that you are reading now and would recommend?
Oh, so many. I know I have to, I keep meaning to start some sort of list online, because whenever someone asks me in the moment, then I both become fearful I'll forget someone so important that I'll be like, how could I forget that? Then I also have that anxiety, which leads me to be like, I've never read a book before in my life. What is every time someone asks me for recommendation, I'm like,
Yeah.
books, what are those? But you know, I mean, I think there's just really an explosion of visionary fiction writers. Um, and I meant to say this at the beginning, but I just want to be clear. I started talking about visionary fiction as someone who has been deeply involved in social change movements, because I felt like there was not enough sort of emphasis on that intersection between imaginative fiction and social change. But I also don't think everything has to be visionary fiction. I mean, that's one of the principles of visionary fiction. That's one of the principles of Adrian's emergent strategy, is to grow and make possibilities. It is generative. And so, you know, I absolutely think, you know, Adrian always says, how do we say yes and rather than no but? So how do we say, you know, yes, we have place for dystopias, and we have place for utopias, and we have place for everything that may not be visionary fiction. So I think all of those things are important, and I meant to say that at the beginning, because I'm certainly not arguing everything should be visionary fiction. I think that's one of the amazing things when you engage in speculative imaginings, is that you have infinite possibilities. We live in a quantum universe. We can engage in quantum organizing and recognize that there is more than enough space for all of this at once. And when you look at historic movements for change, you see that all of the successful movements for change have used a multiplicity of strategies and tactics. So I just wanted to frame that as, you know, visionary fiction doesn't have to be the only answer, but I do think it's an important part of the answer. So with that disclaimer, I do think there's a lot of folks who are writing visionary fiction, and then there's a lot of folks like I call Octavia's work visionary fiction. I don't know if she would call it that, but as the place where I've learned much of this, I want to honor that. I also look to Ursula K. Le Guin as someone whose work, who again may not have cared about being called visionary fiction, but to me has been a foundational part of this work. But you know, I think there are a lot of new folks. I'm, you know, really in love with the work of Nnedi Okorafor, who's written so much, including comic books. But her book, Who Fears Death, I think is an incredible exploration. She has a YA novel called Akata Witch, Akata Witch, and I actually would hope that every young person reads it. I read it as an adult and found it incredible and inspiring, and really wished it had been around when I was younger. N.K. Jemisin is one of the most incredible world builders that I think has existed in this genre. And her work is so deeply rooted in an understanding of power, and refusing to create worlds that pretend that power doesn't exist and hierarchy doesn't exist. I think a lot of times folks want to talk about fantasy as a place you go to escape. But N.K. Jemisin is very clear that we're building these fantasy worlds out of this world, and we have to contend with that. So, I mean, I think there's so many incredible folks. There's some really amazing anthologies that have come out. Rosaria Publishing is doing incredible. Just their whole catalog is amazing. There's an anthology called So Long Hidden, which is sort of fantastical writing centering marginalized communities, but in the past. So in the American past, there's like magic and fantasy and POC, and it's amazing. So yeah, I mean, I could go on and and just be like, and another thing.
And another thing. So just one quick, and then just one comment. If somebody has never read anything by Octavia E. Butler, where's an entry point? What's your first recommendation?
I mean, we were talking about this, Liz. Like, I love all of Octavia's work. I think it's incredible. I think right now there's a reason that Parable of the Sower is on the New York Times bestseller list. What is it, 20 some years after it came out? Because it feels very prescient. It feels very important now. So I would encourage folks to start there. But I also, I do think it maybe feels, I'm like, it's great that folks are reading this now, but it does feel a little intense. And perhaps, if you're like, I don't know if emotionally I can read about a worse America than this right now. I think that Lilith's Brood, which is a collection of, it's a trilogy of 3 books, which is the one that focuses on aliens who come to help humans, but are like, you also cannot be left on your own, so you have to genetically merge with us. And the humans are like, wait, what? I think that is a powerful place that covers many of the same issues, but may feel less maybe emotionally heavy if folks try Parable but feel like they need a little break from that.
And I think we're just going to close with this one last comment. We have a commenter, Les Calvo, who she's just thanking you tonight for this talk. She's going to be discussing the Parable series and Emergent Strategies next semester with her students.
Oh, yay.
Thank you. So, Walidah, thank you so much tonight. This was such a beautiful talk, and hope we're inspiring other people, folks who are watching the video tonight and in the future, to go out and explore Octavia E. Butler's work. It's really, really important stuff with a lot to say for the time that we're living in right now. Thank you, Erin, for interpreting.
Thank you.
Don't forget to fill out the online survey. And an extra special thank you to the Oregon Humanities for all their support for this virtual Think and Drink. And Walidah, maybe we'll bring you back down in person sooner than later, I hope.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Thank you for hosting.
And thank you, Matt and Donovan, for all your tech support tonight. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks for watching.